Super cool. Okay, so we're live. Attendees are coming in. Good afternoon, everyone, or hello to wherever you are in the world. Good afternoon from the UK, at least. Just going to wait for a few more folks to log in, and then we shall get things started with our discussion today on diversity, equity, and inclusion in digital. Certainly not a light topic, but clearly a very important one. So just give it a minute while Zoom does its magic of bringing you all in, and we'll get started. Okay, well, we might as well start and see how the list grows as we go, because we've only got about 50 or so minutes until the end of the hour. So it's good to see you all. Welcome again to, I think this is the third of our Oxford Digital Leaders Network sessions, and we'll be still doing them once we go into 2021. Today is the December edition. We'll be doing them, monthly all throughout the coming year, because there's always plenty to talk about. And today it's about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what do leaders in the digital space need to be thinking about, on this very important and I'd argue increasingly heavily discussed topic in leadership teams and at all levels of organizations. And so I'm joined by two guests today. We've got Perry Nightingale, who is the global head, or is it SVP? I always get your title wrong, Perry, so apologies. But basically the guy in charge of creative AI at WPP, working under the CTO. So thinking a lot about how to bring technology, and particularly AI, into the advertising business. And then Rhonda Hadi, my colleague here at Oxford, Saïd, who is an associate professor of marketing and also recently appointed as our associate dean for diversity and inclusion. Taking this role on, and I think, Rhonda, you're a couple of weeks in now, so so it's an interesting journey that Rhonda's on throughout this, and all of us actually on the leadership team are going through. So without further ado, what I thought we'd do to kick things off is I'm going to hand it over to Perry, who's got some examples of work that he and colleagues at WPP have been doing that speak to diversity in the context of digital advertising. Which I think we'll use as a bit of a starting point or provocation then for a sort of a more free-ranging conversation among us all. And feel free, of course, as always, to pop your questions, comments, thoughts into the Q&A, and I'll weave those in as we go. So Perry, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, I should start by saying that AI is managing about $400 billion of marketing every year, Andrew. I'm afraid the AI sort of train has kind of hit our industry full on. And, our sort of biggest competitors / partners in that space, Google and Facebook, each between them take $170 billion of that market. And they have the most advanced AI departments in the world, frankly, because of the level of management that goes on there. So I'm in charge, though, of looking at creative AI and really whether or not AI will ever be able to generate adverts by itself. And at the moment, the AI is carefully curating and managing that $400 billion worth of digital media in the same way that it manages your Facebook feed and your TikTok stream and all of those other things. And in fact, that's in some ways why the advertising fits so seamlessly into those platforms. But my job is to think about, will machines make that jump from curating human content into generating content by itself? So that's roughly what my role is to look at. You know, roughly 70% of the impact of those ads is still human creativity after, you know, 7 or 8 years of this being a sort of incredibly mechanized corner of the economy. So, and it's holding up. It's holding up. So I'm going to just share this little presentation that I have here, if that's okay, which is one that I give to the MBA students every year, roughly, and to one or two other kind of courses and universities around the world as well. This is my job, though, mainly to look at using AI to speed up the creative process. So, you know, the amount of work we're asked to do just increases and increases and increases every year, because there are new formats and new channels, and we have new data about people, so we can target them with different colors of cars and different landscapes and backgrounds. You know, and obviously the ability to do that faster than your competitors is a key sort of opportunity you get with AI. And I think AI is very much about scale. You're going to see that theme right the way through this little presentation. It's only 5 to 10 minutes long, but really AI delivers scale. So I mean, in the medical space, you could take 10,000 x-rays that have been labeled fractured or not fractured, and you could train an AI on the fractures, and then you can use that to scan millions and millions and millions of them very, very quickly. So AI is all about scale. And, you know, I was doing some research into whether or not we could speed up the creative process. So you have a person here doing a very quick sketch of a parrot. This was a piece of research I did for a conservation NGO called Wild Aid, who interestingly can't use real animals in their advertising because their entire you know, proposition is around reducing the trafficking of wildlife. So we have to go to virtual animals in that kind of case anyway. So drawing very rapidly. And then I trained an AI on roughly 20,000 images of these parrots in the wild. So these were images that had been taken on other sort of wildlife documentaries and those types of things. I trained an AI for about 36 hours on those pictures. And it basically allows you to paint these parrots ultimately. So it takes the sketch that the human has done and delivers a parrot based on what it's learned in the training. So this is, you know, I'm lucky enough to have a job which is all about thinking about how artists will make work in 10 years' time. And what you're seeing here is, you know, really what I believe is the Photoshop of the 21st century, where, you know, you're going to have people dragging and dropping these assets probably onto these dual screen devices. This research was done with Microsoft, and an AI here is delivering, you know, a pretty convincing ad in less than 4 seconds, right? There's just no way humans can keep up with this kind of velocity of content. So, you know, I think what you're looking at here is the creative process of, you know, maybe 20, you know, maybe kind of 2030, 2040. Made some beautiful, beautiful images. I mean, it's also capable of creating parrots that never existed in the real world. So square parrots and perfectly circular parrots. I mean, my job, you know, I enjoy this job. I mean, you get to see amazing things quite often, and have fun with this stuff. But as I said, you know, this is going to transform the way that buildings are designed. It's going to transform the way that cars are designed, you know, where you will have senior architects. And again, we can talk about that a bit later on as to the career paths of creatives in the next 20 years. But you'll have senior creatives sketching their visions. And then rather than junior creatives going away and doing all of the weight analysis and all of those types of things, it will be AI that will deliver those things. So we should spare a bit of time in the next hour to talk about you know, really career progression in an environment where AI is empowering senior people by doing the simpler jobs that junior people did. That is a real issue that I'm tackling at the moment inside WPP. But this is what I think the thrust of this little section should be around, and that is the ethics of what we're doing. So the biggest cost after the production of this work is typically the people that appear in it. And obviously, the more people you have at your sort of disposal for the ads, the more sort of effective they are. So you can show people the people that look like them typically in order to get them to click on this stuff. And so for a while, what we've been doing is researching deepfakes to create people for advertising. And this is not something that just sits in labs. This exists out in the real world. You will have seen adverts with people in it that are not real. And, you know, these faces are effectively just pixel values to a machine. They're no different to an Excel spreadsheet, really. And if you have a data set of enough of them, at 32,000 in this case, that have been labeled, the AI will learn the patterns of the pixels that have those labels and allow you to apply those features onto other faces. So you can say, right, this is Danny in the office in this case, but I want to see it with this blonde. I want it to have, be smiling. I want to change the age. And I realized quite early on that we would hook those things up to those targeting algorithms. And this is very much this tipping point we're at in the industry, where our targeting algorithms become generative algorithms. They generate landscapes first, but soon faces, based on what you're likely to click on. So the more you click on smiling people, the more ads will smile back at you. The more you click on blonder people, the blonder ads will go. The more you click on older people, the older people in ads will get. And if you only clicked on guys on the internet when you bought stuff, in the end, you would only be looking at males, right? So this is something our industry is thinking very hard about how we want to deploy. They're getting better. Every year they get better. There's deep discussions going on around whether this is a solution to diversity in our industry. And there are two fiercely competing camps, one of which says, well, we're just going to end up shooting the same people we shoot every time anyway if we don't do this. And a group of people saying artificial people are not the solution to this problem. This is a bad thing. And I'm very much in that camp. I don't think this is fair on the people who sort of view the ads, or more importantly, the people who ought to have been in the ads. However, you are more likely, for example, to join the police force if you see someone in an advert in uniform that looks like you. So by not deploying these tools, we've now chosen to make your city more transparent but less safe. And that's some of the decisions that are a little bit harder than using them to sell the latest VW. But this is probably the one that Andrew wanted me to share most. And this came out of the labs about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it was some studies we were doing around the effect of age on persuasion, and whether or not younger people in adverts will make you more likely to click on them or not. Just so we could get a handle on how those algorithms would perform in the real world. And on the men, it would work perfectly. So what I've done here is created a fake person at 2 different ages. So, you have a young version and an older version, but this is both 2 ages of the same virtual avatar. And they're flawless, actually. I mean, you wouldn't be able to tell. I mean, as I've said, you will have been experiencing these without knowing for some time, but, you would not be able to tell if you saw one of these in an advert, which is what we were aiming for. However, the women, as we aged them with this algorithm, seemed to take on more masculine features. And this was a consistent effect we would see as we were doing the research, and we couldn't understand why it was happening. And when we went back to the data set, we saw that there was a gender age bias. So there was double the number of young women's faces in the data set. So between the ages of 20 and 29, double the number of young women. And there were half the number of older women. And so the AI had effectively taught itself that the age was a male thing. Actually, you'll see the earrings disappeared. And interestingly, going the other way, I notice the younger guy on the left has the beginnings of an earring. So the AI has essentially taught itself a link between age and gender. FFHQ, by the way, is not a small WPP research data set. This is the de facto data set for AI research in the world. This is NVIDIA's primary face recognition data set. Millions of people, probably not millions, thousands and thousands of data scientists will be using this data set. And we've gone back to them and made sure these warnings are put there. So, I mean, I think, I'm going to park it there in a way of saying that, diversity is a part of our industry, not just from a leadership point of view. Diversity is something that our machines are capable of and not capable of. And what I think I've noticed is that when you don't have diversity in your people, you end up with no diversity in your machines. FFHQ was assembled by white middle-aged men. And that is what I see on every Teams call, every Zoom call, is grids of men working on this stuff. And I think, that's a big issue, I think, in our kind of industry that we have to kind of tackle. I'd also say just on one more thing on the faces back here, which was the example that I used at the very beginning, L'Oreal. It was only, I've been instructed to use this on a pitch, right? This technology for L'Oreal. And it was only, and all of the rooms full of men thought it was a fantastic idea. And it was only when we actually got to rooms with women where they were like, this would be a really, really, really bad idea to do this from a brand point of view for L'Oreal. And I think diversity is very important because, half your customers, half of society are women. right? And if you're making decisions in a room where you're 100% men, you're losing a voice that is critical, I think. So I campaign for more women in AI and data science and digital in general. It's a big issue. I've called for it on the panels, right, Andrew? I mean, I've said a few times that, you know, that I expect to see diversity on panels at Oxford and those places when I talk. So yeah, it matters. Yeah, it matters.
All right. So I think there's tons that we could talk about.
It's like, that was the typical Perry download. Sorry, yeah, Andrew. Okay. It'll be okay. This is all in a lab, by the way. I should just say straight away. This all takes place in controlled environments. We are not unleashing millions of virtual humans on society tomorrow. We are working with Oxford to understand, you know, how these things play out in society. So don't be worried about that side of things.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's I mean, indeed, a big open question how people feel about this. But you know, so actually, that is kind of where I want to start us in this conversation. Is thinking about, because there's this tension, right? So we're talking about advertising in this case, but you know, the idea to at least portray diversity is you know, arguably seen as a very good thing, at least to show people, you know, diversity. And so I can imagine that for some corporations or some clients that your agencies would work with, they do see sort of synthetic humans as a solution to that. It's like, well, look, we don't need to go out and find these people. Let's just, you know, have the AI create them. I mean, is that the sort of thing, or is there, or people not as to me that's scary if they think that way, but maybe others would disagree. But is that coming, or is that here already? What are clients asking for?
I mean, there are startups pitching that as the solution to diversity. So I mean, we know there are startups doing that already. Okay. I have not seen a large scale enterprise campaign decision to use that for diversity for precisely the reasons. I think, to be honest, the public backlash against that would, in my mind, be quite major. Do you know what I mean? I think especially in the wake of sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff, if you were creating, you know, people of color artificially for diversity, I think you would expect some negative headlines. You know, but it becomes less clear cut when you're potentially using algorithms, say for age, you know, where you're creating multiple versions of ages of people in the ads, which you can do in Photoshop, by the way. Anyone for however much it is, £20 a month or something, can download a copy of Photoshop, and there's a feature just as of the last few months called neural filters, which will use AI to create as many different ages as you kind of want, basically. And that, you know, I think that the danger is that it plays into society's own sort of negative behavior, you know, that we might create 100 versions of ages, but you might find that over time the trend would just be towards younger and younger and younger, and that, you know, there's lots of complications around that. But when it comes to diversity in leadership, I think it's just critical that you have a diverse point of view. You know what I mean? Like, it's a diverse group of people making that decision. It's so critical from a moral standpoint. It's critical because it's affecting these groups in society. But I actually think it's a more effective voice when it's a diverse voice, I found.
Rhonda, let's hear your thoughts. Again, kind of pick what you want to pick on from what Perry showed, but because there's, the way I see it, there's sort of the advertising aspect, but there's these broader points about leadership. And actually we probably should come back to the skills aspect later as well, because that's got me thinking about inclusion. So there's a lot we could cover, but, you know, Rhonda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, such a fantastic presentation and so much to react to. And so I do have thoughts at the sort of broader, maybe organizational sort of HR level, and then more narrowly at the marketing level, and then even more narrowly at the kind of technology AI interface level. And so I think it's actually really helpful to just lay out exact definitions of what we mean by diversity and inclusion, because many people would argue that diversity itself is a fact. Essentially, it refers to differences that exist within our society, within our organizations, within our teams. But inclusion is a choice to actually make individuals who exhibit all these differences actually feel like they are included and can be themselves and be leveraged for their differences in, again, their organizations or in their teams. And so I think some of the examples that Perry highlighted sort of show that, you know, it's not just about increasing representation in a way that I would argue almost promotes tokenism, but really actually including people from diverse backgrounds in decision making to begin with. And so, you know, there's like Perry also pointed out, it's not just a moral imperative. There's a really very clear business imperative too, and tons of studies that have shown how diverse teams come out with lead to enhanced KPIs, even though sometimes decisions take longer. It takes longer to gain consensus. Usually ideas generated are better, and that can help. It's not foolproof, but can at least help prevent situations like some of the advertisements you see that, you know, maybe recently you've seen the Tresemme example in South Africa, where it has the before hair as African-American hair and then white blonde hair as the after hair, which just seems like such an obvious, you know, who is behind that advertisement? It's so obviously offensive. But again, sometimes there are not diverse teams at the table. And even if there is a diverse team, if people don't feel comfortable enough to voice their dissent or their concerns, then you may as well not have diversity to begin with. So those are sort of my thoughts at the organizational level. And again, tons of, you know, I'm not an organizational behavior scholar, but tons of research has documented how diverse teams lead to better business outcomes. And then from the marketing perspective, I think ideas surrounding kind of diversity and the risk of harmful stereotypes really hits a lot of different areas of marketing. I think, you know, algorithmic bias is a great example, but also everything from customer experience. If you think about the whole kind of shopping while black phenomenon, and you know what people experience in retail stores, for example, to branding. And there's kind of recently been, I think actually you shared, Andrew, an SNL skit about brands like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben that were, you know, based on caricatures of slaves. Now, you know, finally, so many years later, kind of being phased out to, you know, content creation. So yeah, lots of things to talk about and to react to. But yeah, those are some initial thoughts.
So Perry, what do you think in terms of the back to kind of the point you were saying at the beginning about sort of, you know, AI taking away certain jobs? Because when you were saying that, I hadn't really connected that. Before you'd said that, I hadn't connected that to thinking about diversity and inclusion. I'd thought about it.
I see that really impacting younger people coming into the industry. I really do. I think, you know, I think the thing is that AI it struggles with these higher order things, right? It struggles with a creative vision for building. And I do talk about architecture a lot because you know, it's been through a number of evolutions. And it would be good actually, Andrew, to have an architect at some point help out in one of these sessions, because I'm talking about this third hand from what I hear from, you know, UAL and places like that as well. But like, you know, there was a period in the 90s where simulations were able to create buildings, you know, and you suddenly saw buildings got very curvy in the 90s. I've seen the Gherkin, these things. And really you had architects designing for what computers were capable of. And that was a sort of trend. And then it kind of evolved into a situation we have been in for a few years where, you know, a senior architect can have a vision and then the simulations can fit the vision using AI, right? Which is what I showed you there with the sketch and the building. And that, you know, that's a paradigm shift. I mean, I'm not sure what happened, you know, in the earlier phase of architecture, but what you're definitely seeing now is, you know, is junior architects not getting the traditional jobs they had before, which was the weight analysis and the structure and all of those things, where, to be honest, they learn an important part of their craft, I suspect. And there's also this sort of situation where, you know, the senior people are telling themselves, well, these people will just go somewhere and do, well, they'll do other work. So it frees them. There's this sort of idea that they'll be freed up to do other work. But I mean, you know, that there tends not to be a lot of, you know, spare work sloshing around in businesses that I've ever been aware of. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, I think what will happen is they'll leave the industry, and then I can't really imagine them having a junior career or having a career path somewhere else and then coming back into the creative industries as senior creatives to do their thing. And I'm very worried that we're going to have beautiful skylines for 10, 15 years till all of those senior architects retire. And then there won't be this, there won't be this kind of, will have sliced across the career path. And that I mean, it sounds like theory, but that is what is playing out in the universities, that junior architects are coming in to learn machine learning and AI and those types of things. So, it may be fine. We're an incredibly adaptive society, I've sort of learned over 15 odd years in digital. I was incredibly worried about, kids' imaginations and on all of these sorts of things when we were making games and apps, when I was doing that earlier in my career, but that has held up relatively well. So, I think economies adapt, and they don't, we'll find ways around that, the way they train. But I do think automation, that falls under. And when you automate, you have diversity issues, because automation tends to benefit these high, especially when it comes to AI, these higher order, decision makers, basically. And yeah.
Yeah, so it becomes a pipeline problem, really, doesn't it, Rhonda? I mean, this sort of sense of, from a leadership standpoint, and particularly for leaders thinking about digitization, automation, thinking about, if the automation or the digitization essentially takes away sort of a certain layer of types of jobs, and those jobs may or may not, but suppose they are the ones that might be more accessible to a wider group of people, there may be entry point jobs and so on. It's almost kind of like technology inadvertently putting up another barrier, which is really a new concept to me. So I'm curious, what you're thinking in this, Rhonda, because it's, I'd never thought about automation, for example, as having that type of impact. There's other sorts of, impacts that tend to be talked about more with automation, but not necessarily the one that might basically, reduce the opportunities to recruit a more diverse labor force.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to me, the root of that problem goes back to diversity and inclusion, in that it's problematic if, to begin with, people at the more senior levels are not representing diversity, and you only have diversity in the lower levels of the organization, in which case there are only certain positions that are being supplanted by AI, and those happen to be correlated with greater diversity. So I mean, to me, that's the problematic part of that situation. And I think that goes back to this idea behind, not only focusing on representation and who you bring into your teams or into your organizations, but also mechanisms for promotion and retention for people, to make sure that you're getting those people to stay and advance their careers and get to reach sort of all levels of the organization, so that it is not just one level that's getting supplanted by AI. And I mean, I think that that kind of discussion about the role of AI as replacing versus augmenting, I think almost everyone says it's augmenting is the better idea. AI can maybe inform decisions, but you need some sort of human decision maker, at least kind of vetting decisions along the way. And I think some of Perry's examples interestingly highlight the importance of the data set, and how data sets in and of themselves can be biased. And if you don't have representation in your data set, whether that be not having images of enough older women, or whatever that happens to be, then your output is going to be biased in a particular way. So
what about using AI? I mean, to the point of sort of augmented intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. I don't know, are there ways that we could use that augmented intelligence approach, AI, sort of to even help us detect bias? Whether we're talking about with people, or there's a conversation I know about, Perry, that I've been having with one of our postdocs, Natalia, around can we develop some kind of AI to detect misogyny in scripts for ads, for example, or some of these things that are harmful and harder to detect. It's relatively easy, for example, to screen out violence or terrorism or blood and gore and nudity and these sorts of things in terms of content online. But it's harder to do these things that are more subtle and very nuanced in their meanings. So is that the sort of thing that we could progress towards in terms of thinking about how we can use technology to actually help us solve these problems? I'm just curious where we might be at with that, or if people are working on those sorts of things.
Yeah, of course, and they're very happy to sell you them.
They work.
You know, as this world works, you know, because there's a technical way of doing that. I mean, I would say as well that, you know, there's an interesting angle on that full stop, which is that humans are not great at putting older women in adverts. You know, that's a well-known phenomenon in film. You know, that there's a sort of you know, an age at which women rarely begin to appear in films, right? And that's, you know, so people are worse than machines in many ways at doing that. And you can fix a machine; it's much harder to fix a human. Do you know what I mean? And that sounds like a weird thing to say, but like, you know, a lot of those prejudices have been built up over many years often, and it's just very, very difficult to go and reprogram that. And you see that in the justice sector, where AI is used for reoffending. For example, if you reoffend in the north of England or in America, after you've been to prison, you come out, you reoffend, that you are put through an algorithm called HART, H-A-R-T, I think. And, you know, the algorithm will go through where you grew up and where you went to school, and if your parents were married or not married, and, you know, and did you get a degree, and these types of things. And then we'll ultimately send you back to prison or not. So it gives the judge the information, and then the judge makes the call. That sends, I mean, everyone's quite horrified by that, but that sends less people back to prison and less people reoffend. And it actually sends less people of color back to prison as well than humans. Do you know what I mean? There are ingrained biases. I mean, you're more likely to send someone, if you're a judge, you're more likely to send people back to prison before lunchtime because you're hungry. Do you know what I mean? So humans are, you know, we're not great at doing those things. However, you know, there's interesting moral arguments within that, because if you're someone who would not have reoffended, but the algorithm says that you would have, the situation is skewed against you, because the judge thinks, well, if I let this person go and they do something terrible, I'm going to be in a load of trouble. But if I put them into you know, if they put them into jail, you know, then it won't matter either way. And, you know, we find that those systems work for the majority of cases, but they badly penalize a smaller number. And that's what we see in algorithmic bias all over the place, in finance and those sorts of places. If you've got a great business idea, but you happen to be, you know, someone from a part of, with the wrong postcode, you can be heavily penalized and it can ruin your life. Do you know what I mean? Because that system's been set up for that. And actually in recruitment, I use an example, which is, you know, if you single-handedly, because a lot of AI is used a lot in recruitment increasingly, and if you single-handedly saved a Canadian family from a bear on holiday and you put that in your CV, it wouldn't mean anything because the AI had never seen that before. Whereas if you set up a pretty well-functioning fashion blog at 16, it will have correlated that with success loads of times. So, you know, AI really penalizes difference. Do you know what I mean? It really penalizes the things it sees less of, which is why it's harder if you're black to open your phone with a mask on and all of these things, right? It's sort of, you know, because it sees less of those. So it's, you know, I find AI there's a homogeneity issue there. It will tend, you are penalized for being different in an algorithmic world.
So we've got a question that's come in from Bjorna. So talk about just AI for architecture, and it's very interesting. So comes from a naval architecture background. So do you think AI can automate the creation of engineering structures, not just the glossy photo designs? Because this is highly manual CAD designing today, for example, at Rolls-Royce. Maybe I'll start with that. So actually, many of you probably, or all of you, why would you know? I in my former life, before becoming a marketing academic, I was a structural engineer. But this was back in the days where it was quite manual, and software were there to help with design, but not really to take over the design. But I think, you know, since then, a lot's probably changed in architecture and engineering design and structural design and so on. And so I think it's just interesting to think about, you know, getting into the, you know, sort of the skeleton of a structure, if you will, as opposed to just sort of the, you know, as the question says, the look of something. I guess I don't see any reason why not. Rhonda, Perry, I mean, I know none of us are experts on.
My brother is an aeronautical engineer. He's at Rolls-Royce. He actually is an aeronautical engineer at Rolls-Royce. And I should phone him really and ask him if he thinks AI is going to replace his job. But he's not had a great year, it has to be said. So I probably will leave automation on that.
I do think, back to your point about, AI does well with things it's seen before. Is an important instructive point here. So to the extent that designs, whether we're talking engineering design or we're talking about any kind of problem solving, I would argue, to the extent to which the problem is novel or sort of rare in some sense, or unique, I think that's where human comes in. If it's a repetitive thing, if it's sort of a more basic sort of design, then maybe that's where the automation in that sense can be applicable. I think it just depends.
I mean, I think this is so technical that you'd probably want someone from NVIDIA on the pharma side or something, because I sort of imagine that protein structures and these kind of things. I mean, I know DeepMind actually just last week created 3D protein structures in AI, which was this critical step to be able to simulate real proteins because they're 3-dimensional or something, right? So there's, it's a bit like computer games. I think we're in a transition between 2D and 3D.
Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of AI is inherently 2D. All of these pictures are 2D that I'm showing you. They're not 3-dimensional. So I think a transition needs to happen. But I mean, absolutely, if you want to be on the bleeding edge of that industry, then there's a big opportunity to go and have a look at what AI is capable of doing, because I think it's your edge. This stuff is your edge. I mean, your ability to produce ads in 4 seconds, high quality, is your edge. It's the difference when you walk into pitching, 500 pieces of work in 2 days versus 100 pieces of work in 1 day. And, time is everything in our industry. So I think,
so that's why I'm wondering with the time thing, and so Rhonda, curious your thoughts on this, because that things needing to be done quickly also suggests that you don't necessarily have time to do a broader consultation, which might in a more diverse organization allow a broader range of voices to be heard. So how do we balance that then? If we're, say, using technology or just moving faster, in the production of an ad or the decision to do something, it doesn't really matter what the sort of the managerial decision is, but the push to go faster also would suggest to me that, you just don't have time to consult a more diverse set of potential, opinions. How might we balance that? I don't have the answers. I don't think any of us really do, but how would you think about that, Rhonda?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the programming. So just as Perry was mentioning, I mean, if you are deliberately trying to, let's say, fight particular biases, you can, for example, in HR functions, program AI to remove names and any other descriptors that might make a recruiter biased in, if it's a signal, let's say if the first name is hard to pronounce or clearly foreign, etc. So you can use AI to actually remove that bias. I've also seen it used more and more in looking at the wording used in job descriptions, because there's certain, something like you might want a salesperson who's clean shaven, which, pretty much means you're looking for a male, or even certain words, collaborative tends to be more female leaning, where ambition usually turns off females. So, and so if you're talking about an organization that's, making tons and tons of job descriptions, that's a great way to specifically program AI in a way that, where you're deliberately trying to actually remove potential bias to increase representation. So I think, that's one solution. And then I think that the inputs also matter. So kind of going back to the example of, if you know that AI is essentially based on pattern recognition and, not very good at picking up anomalies, then you need to make sure that, the one Black person, you don't have just the one Black person in your data set, right? I mean, you need to have more diversity in those inputs. And I think that, the solution of artificially creating diversity and mapping that out to match consumers in digital environments is a little concerning, just due to overall concerns about echo chambers. And so lots of people worry that in digital environments, for example, you are only seeing having products advertised to you, which an algorithm has determined somebody like you tends to like, and then that's limiting your choice. You're only seeing news that the algorithm knows politically leans the way that you lean. And then now, if you're only visually exposed to advertisements that show people that look like you, then exposure theory would actually say that's pretty terrible for our society, because you're only being exposed to, mere exposure to people who are different than you has lots of benefits in terms of creating a more cohesive and progressive society. So I would have concerns about sort of that as a solution, as Perry mentioned.
So how do we prevent these tools from being used in the non-progressive ways? Therefore, is this policy that needs to be set, by governments or advertisers or agencies, or like how do or whoever, I don't know. How do we make sure that we don't get into a world where we only see ads that look like us? Because we could do that, right? We could certainly.
Yeah, we already do that. That already happens. Yeah. That is the way that it's worked for 10 years, and Facebook and Google have grown in particular very rich off the back of that process, right? And even they don't fully understand how an algorithm ends up showing you a certain thing, and it could correlate to your postcode or your friends or whatever it might be, right? But the whole point of that system is designed to to show stuff, and we place Google's own ads actually, so we use the same system, and we sort of tell ourselves that that we are making we're making advertising more valuable to people. They're going to see these ads anyway, and so it would be better if they were seeing ads that were relevant to them, right? It's all about relevance, and I think, to be honest, that's okay. It's when it becomes political data or financial data or pharma data where what I mean? Like if we accidentally show someone a block of cheese instead of a razor, we make a stupid targeting decision. The worst that's happened is you're mildly, you don't even think about it. You see bad targeting every day, 100 times. It's not like we get it right. We actually don't have great algorithms to tell us, and neither do Netflix, for example, why some people like Game of Thrones and House of Cards. That should be impossible, but all the AI would point to that being impossible, but it's the case. And so humans are wonderfully unpredictable, and they defy our algorithms at all sorts of turning. So I think that's already how it works. Now, it's a learned behavior that we have when we're very young. So we reject people who don't look like our parents from the age of 6 months. So this begins very, very, very early in human development. And you could argue that it's a fear mechanism, that it's based on a time when people who didn't look like your parents were very dangerous. And so I am thinking, and we should think as Oxford, as partners going into the next few years about that. Do we intercept that? Do we, I do think we're going into a time when we present our clients with a choice, really, to have less effective media, but more diverse, more diverse mass media. That's a sort of a choice we'll probably offer them, because it will be less effective and it will make less money ultimately. But as Rhonda said, I think we want to live in a society that is diverse, and as these algorithms start making content, that situation will only be sort of supercharged, basically. And if you want me to visualize that, I actually have what that looks like here, because we did do a test of I just share my screen very, very quickly. So we did do a test of that. So this is generating faces. I'm going to click through. Yeah. This is generating faces, and within people clicking, and within 2 or 3 days, these faces, the ones on the top are generated, and the ones at the bottom are the people doing the clicking. They converge within a few days on the faces of the people doing the clicking, and that again, as Rhonda says, that was proof that we 100% will end up with a society that just looks like we do. And I would love to see AI deployed against that, if I'm totally honest. I would love for AI to, to make our world more diverse. And just on the point before that, I don't think diversity should ever be a stage in a process. I think that's the difference between diversity and inclusion in a way. Nothing kills purpose faster than a deadline. Like as soon as you've got a tight deadline, suddenly all of your good sort of ethical decisions seem to go out the window, and you're just like, doesn't matter, let's just do it quickly. And that's what advertising is like in particular, a lot of real world, very fast deadlines. And if you make diversity a stage or a council somewhere that something has to go through, you 100% hit that issue, that it just, that sooner or later something will slip through. If you have diversity as your input, if you're inclusive in the beginning, then you don't have that, you will never run that risk of sacrificing it when perhaps you didn't mean to.
So we are approaching being out of time. So, I think there's lots of interesting things to talk about here, but I want to bring it back to kind of sort of thinking about actions that leaders should be taking now, if not already, because indeed, these are not sort of tick box things that we need to think about, but a lot of organizations have to go on this journey of trying to become, first of all, to have a more diverse employee base, to think about how they can become more inclusive, but then also in the work that they produce. I like the conversations we've had around, how can we use AI in the service of helping us with this? So actually, Rhonda, when you were talking about job descriptions, I the immediate thought that came to mind is, why can't Microsoft put something into Microsoft Word, sort of a Clippy-esque feature? It looks like you're writing a job description. Let me help you make it less gender biased, things like that. So maybe those sorts of tools are coming, and certainly they would be feasible. But what about this journey? So I'm sure many of us, all of us on the panel here included, but also in the audience watching this, work in complex industries, complex organizations that are somewhere along here. So Rhonda, maybe just to wrap things up, not to put you on the spot, but just to sort of talk a little bit about journey here, because it's sort of a question of, I suppose, where you start, but also how do you start approaching these ideals that we're talking about, as quickly as possible, even when change may well take a lot of time. So how do you get going?
So if I were to think of very rough categories that need to be adapted, obviously, to the specific organization, I know what we're thinking about now at the business school is inputs. So who are we bringing into our organization? And so representation absolutely matters. But you can't stop there. And of course, it's not just recruiting, and also questions like retention, promotion, et cetera, also have to be examined. And then it's not just who you bring in the community, but what's happening within the community in terms of, do you have opportunities to build awareness and facilitate discussions where people really listen to each other and hear different experiences, ideally in a place where it's safe, because so many people are just always afraid to say the wrong thing and don't want to be offensive. And then as a result, people just don't talk about these issues at all. But that really, I think, reduces overall empathy within the organization and understanding of others' experiences. So I would say kind of awareness building, ideally some type of, implicit bias training, where people can actually, I think people are often surprised to uncover some of their own implicit biases, and really celebrations of diversity internally. And then what are your outputs? So as a business school, I think our goal is to train, world-class leaders tackling world-scale problems. And ideally, those would be leaders who are aware of their own implicit biases and can leverage diverse teams wherever they happen to be. So, your organization's inputs certainly are going to be, outputs rather, are going to be different. That might be producing advertising, which, you want to ideally have a positive effect on society. But I think those are at least three very, very kind of abstract, high-level buckets to think about.
And Perry, how's WPP approaching this?
That I 100% agree with what Rhonda said there, and that's, this is a people solution, not a technology solution. It's an organizational solution, not an algorithm solution. And we do have tools that we use for measurement, but we're trying to instill a culture of diversity, and that and that's what the way the CEO talks, and and on our board, diversity on our board. And honestly, it's complex and simple at the same time. Do you mean, like, it is a really complicated picture, but the central solution is kindness and inclusion? Do you know what I mean? Which we all ought to have learned at primary school. Do you know what I mean? And that, I do take time when I teach the MBA for a couple of slides on doing the right thing, so the difference between right and wrong, because sometimes you can forget it in a senior position, right? But it comes down to empathy. How would I feel if I was receiving this business decision? And that, how would I feel if I was a junior person being automated? These are soft skills that I think as a business school you should take time for. But as all leaders, I think they also matter.
Mm-hmm.
And they will ultimately be the thing that prevents you having one of those Tresemme headlines, which could destroy your business. Just one mistake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for years. So I think that's what I would say.
Yep, and I think the stakes are very high, as you pointed out. Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much running up against the clock here. So I want to say thanks to Rhonda and Perry for taking some time to talk with us this afternoon. There's always more to talk about with these sorts of issues, and I think it's something that we just have to all keep an eye on. It was really interesting to bring sort of the technology and AI aspect into it as much as the people aspect, and indeed more the people aspect. So thanks, Rhonda. Thanks, Perry. For all of you who joined us today, or those of you who are watching this later on, thanks for joining. As I said, our next Oxford Digital Leaders Network meeting shall be in January 2021. And what I'd like you all to do is to give us some ideas for topics you'd like us to discuss. So we'll send out a poll and or just a survey, so that you can give us some suggestions of what you'd like to hear more about as we move into the new year, and we'll do our best to weave that into our agenda as we go forward. But as always, hope you're all well. Hope you're all taking care of yourselves. I hope you find some time to wind down as we approach the end of what has been one heck of a year. And happy holidays and all of that. And we'll see you in January. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.